Police lieutenant's wife threatened an officer. Judge Caprio's verdict was perfect justice. February 12, 2025, 9:03 a.m. The winter sun barely pierced the thick gray clouds over Hartford, Connecticut, but the marble steps of 450 Main Street gleamed under the dull morning light, polished as if to reflect the expectations of those who walked them. Claudia Dunbar appeared at the top of the courthouse steps like a figure cut from the fabric of entitlement itself. At 38, she carried herself with the precision of someone accustomed to being noticed, every gesture measured, every breath timed to perfection. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble, a staccato rhythm that echoed through the stone columns and into the lobby, announcing her presence before she even crossed the threshold. The sound drew the eyes of officers, clerks, and early arriving citizens alike. Some instinctively straightened, while others looked away, unsure whether they were being tested or merely witnessing habit. The habit of a woman who expected the world to bend. A soft whisper passed through the hall as she stepped inside. The echo of her name, Dunbar, murmured like a warning. She carried a cream-colored designer purse with an almost imperceptible tilt of the wrist, the kind that suggested she alone knew the weight of its contents, or perhaps that its weight was irrelevant compared to the presence she exuded. Her gaze swept across the room, scanning the officers at the security desks, the clerks filing papers behind the counters, the small cluster of early spectators who had braved the cold to watch a case that had already become local headline fodder. Each glance was calculated, sharp, predatory in its way, expecting acknowledgement, deference, the subtle nods of those who recognized influence when they saw it. Judge Caprio sat behind the bench, a man of quiet authority and measured gaze. Case, Chalkers T25, CT 1129 lay before him, a simple docket number that would soon carry the weight of public scrutiny. He did not flinch. He did not glance down at his notes or frown at her entrance. When Claudia's eyes briefly flicked toward him, searching for the bow of recognition she assumed was owed, his calm voice cut across the chamber. "In this courtroom, you are a citizen," he said, the words falling like stones into the hush that followed her arrival. The precision of his tone left no room for ambiguity. Authority here was not measured in wealth, in name, or in influence. Authority was measured in law and in principle, and it was absolute. Claudia's smirk arrived almost reflexively, the curl of her lips a mixture of amusement and dismissive challenge. It was the sort of expression that had worked countless times before, in gala halls, at exclusive clubs, in corporate corridors, where doors opened because of connections, not merit. But here, the smirk met a wall of unwavering calm. The air seemed to tighten, almost imperceptibly, as if the courtroom itself had drawn a collective breath, waiting for the first sparks to fly between entitlement and impartiality. Officers at the perimeter shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, others crossed arms, leaning against the wall as though bracing for a confrontation they already sensed. The gallery murmured softly, whispers threading like currents beneath the weight of expectation. There was anticipation here, a subtle collective understanding that privilege was about to be tested against the immutable force of procedure. Even the clerk at the front desk seemed to hold her breath, pencil poised over a docket, aware that the day's rhythm might change under the collision of presence and principle. Claudia adjusted her posture, straightening her back, tilting her chin just slightly upward, a motion that had always signaled quiet dominance. The motion was practiced, perfected, a habit born of decades spent moving through spaces where acknowledgement was automatic. Yet beneath the surface, there was the tiniest flicker of hesitation, barely visible in the milliseconds before she fully entered the courtroom. It was a glimmer, a shadow of uncertainty that perhaps, just perhaps, not every space would bend to her will. The first whispers among the spectators began to coalesce into quiet speculation. "That's Lieutenant Dunbar's wife," someone said, voice low, urgent with the thrill of proximity. "They say she tried to intimidate the officer." The words hung in the air, fragile but potent, signaling the undercurrent of tension that would soon grow impossible to ignore. Claudia's eyes drifted across the courtroom again, seeking affirmation, respect, recognition. But the only response was the impartiality of Judge Caprio's steady gaze and the quiet, unflinching attention of those assembled. The atmosphere thickened. The clock ticked. 9:04, 9:05. Each passing second drew the tension tauter, like a string pulled to the breaking point. Claudia shifted subtly, a shoulder raising just a fraction, a micro-adjustment meant to convey calm control, though beneath it, her fingers gripped the edge of her purse with an almost imperceptible tension. She was acutely aware that this moment, the first encounter between entitlement and justice, would set the tone for every interaction that followed. The smirk, the posture, the expectation of deference, all of it would be measured against a standard far higher than any social circle or social media following could enforce. The collision was imminent, and everyone in the room felt it, consciously or not. Privilege had walked in, assuming the world would bend. The law had already spoken, quietly, firmly, and without compromise. And in that silent, charged moment, the first real confrontation of the day began. Not with words, not yet, but in the poised stances, the measured breaths, and the subtle shift of energy that only true moral reckoning can provoke. At 9:06 a.m., the clerk called the case. Claudia's eyes met Judge Caprio's again, and for the first time, the faintest uncertainty shadowed her practiced confidence. She was here to assert dominance, but already the courtroom's impartiality began to rewrite the rules she thought she knew. This was the day entitlement met accountability, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The morning sunlight slanted through the tall windows of Hartford's 450 Main Street Courthouse, casting elongated rectangles across the polished oak floor. It was 9:18 a.m. on February 12, 2025, and the room hummed with restrained anticipation. Claudia Dunbar had been seated for barely 15 minutes, yet her presence already commanded attention. Her fingers tapped lightly on the edge of her designer purse, the motion almost imperceptible, but deliberate, a reminder, she seemed to think, of the influence she wielded beyond these walls. From the first moments inside the courtroom, Claudia tested the limits of authority. Her phone had been silenced, but she leaned toward her lawyer, whispering names and connections as though the sheer weight of recognition might tilt the balance in her favor. "Call my friend at the precinct," she murmured, voice low but edged with expectation. "Make sure someone remembers who we are." Her eyes flicked toward the clerks, officers, even the gallery, scanning for acknowledgement, subtle nods, the slightest bend of deference. Each gesture, every glance, was a calculated assertion of entitlement. Her lawyer, Daniel Kessler, a man whose gray hair suggested years of navigating high-stakes cases, leaned in and murmured, "Claudia, let's just let the court proceed. Stay calm." His tone was more habitual than persuasive, lacking the conviction needed to actually temper her behavior. Claudia only smiled, a small, practiced curl of her lips, the kind that had carried her through countless social encounters, but found no echo in the firm eyes of Judge Caprio. "Mrs. Dunbar," the judge's voice rang out, calm and deliberate, yet carrying an authority that made every whisper in the room fade into tense silence. "In this courtroom, decorum is not optional. Your position outside these walls carries no weight here. You will address this proceeding with the same respect owed to every citizen." Claudia's smirk faltered, a micro-flicker that almost went unnoticed. Her fingers tightened slightly on the purse strap. The first fissure in her armor appeared, and the room sensed it instinctively. Murmurs rippled among the gallery, soft but unmistakable, as if the air itself acknowledged that entitlement was meeting immovable law. Officer Samuel Hayes, 29, a patrolman with 5 years on the force and a reputation for integrity, took the stand. His uniform was pressed, badge gleaming faintly in the mid-morning light. He inhaled slowly, exhaling through his nose, as though steadying against the weight of not just the testimony, but the scrutiny that followed. "Officer Hayes," Judge Caprio began, voice even, "please recount the events of December 17th, 2024, on 22nd Street. Hayes straightened, hands gripping the edges of the stand. "Yes, Your Honor. I was issuing a routine citation for a traffic violation, license plate 3XQ1124, when Mrs. Dunbar approached. She was aggressive, stepping within inches of me, pointing her finger, shouting threats about my career and safety. She referenced her husband's position repeatedly, implying that I would face consequences if I did not comply with her demands. His eyes met hers for the first time in the courtroom. Claudia's posture shifted minutely, a shoulder rising, a small tightening of the jaw. I recall stating, Hayes continued, voice steady but firm, that I was only performing my duties. Despite that, she raised her voice further, gesturing in a manner I interpreted as intimidation, creating a clear threat to both my professional and personal safety. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. Silence followed, punctuated only by the faint rustle of papers and the soft intake of breath from the gallery. Claudia leaned back slightly, the smirk now tentative. Her eyes darted toward her lawyer, then toward the gallery, as if searching for any sign that her influence had permeated the room. But there was none. The whispers of spectators grew, low murmurs of disapproval, tension threading through the crowd like a taut wire. Every polite gasp, every subtle shift in posture among the attendees was a reminder that here, fame and marital rank were powerless against impartial justice. Judge Caprio's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Mrs. Dunbar, he said, voice soft but insistent, the courtroom has heard the officer's testimony. Intimidation, threats, and the misuse of influence are not excusable under law or ethics. Your position or your connections do not exempt you from accountability. A brief, almost imperceptible tremor passed through Claudia's hands. She adjusted the strap of her purse again, fingers brushing the leather as though seeking comfort. Her smirk, once a shield, now faltered, a fleeting sign of awareness that her usual tactics, subtle threats, references to her husband's rank, the quiet hum of influence, were ineffective. The gallery leaned forward collectively, the energy in the room palpable, sensing that the facade was cracking. The tension built as Officer Hayes returned to the details of that December afternoon, recounting every gesture, every word, the way her voice had escalated, the almost imperceptible lean toward aggression, the intimidation of someone who expected deference. The courtroom absorbed it all, each sentence a chisel against the marble of entitlement, each pause a spotlight on the collision between social power and procedural authority. As Hayes concluded, Claudia's gaze dropped briefly, the first overt acknowledgement of vulnerability in the high-ceiling courtroom. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Her eyes flickered toward Judge Caprio, realizing that here, the law did not bend. The murmurs of the audience rose slightly, a mixture of curiosity and quiet vindication. The first cracks of perceived control had opened, and in their shadow a new narrative was beginning to form. One where entitlement could no longer dictate the terms of justice. By 9:42 a.m., the collision of arrogance and procedure had become undeniable. Claudia's world, once buffered by influence and expectation, was now subject to the relentless precision of law, and the courtroom held its collective breath for the next chapter of reckoning. The courtroom settled into a brittle, almost expectant silence as investigator Rachel Monroe approached the stand at precisely 10:07 a.m., the timestamp on her notebook marking the momentum of the unfolding case. She was 34, meticulous, with a presence that suggested both authority and quiet resilience, the kind of person accustomed to wading through the entanglements of power and human error. As she arranged her documents, the faint click of her pen against the stand punctuated the tension in the room, a subtle drumbeat heralding the exposure of truth. "Your Honor," Monroe began, her voice steady yet threaded with the weight of the material she carried, "I have compiled evidence pertinent to case Gunnar 2025, CT 1129, regarding the December 17, 2024 incident on 22nd Street involving Officer Samuel Hayes and Mrs. Claudia Dunbar." She paused briefly, scanning the gallery. Each observer, lawyers, clerks, citizens, journalists, leaned in, their collective attention taut with anticipation. "First, I will reference the messages exchanged between Mrs. Dunbar and her private assistant, timestamp between 7:15 p.m. and 8:01 p.m., Monroe continued. The language is clear. She instructed staff to ensure her presence would not be questioned and implied repercussions if the citation issued to Officer Hayes was not nullified. She lifted the phone and, without dramatics, allowed the words to resonate in the courtroom. Make sure this officer understands who he's dealing with. I do not tolerate insubordination. Claudia's fingers twitched, the movement almost imperceptible, but the gallery noted it. Her smirk, once a protective shield, now faltered under the weight of documented words and recorded intent. She leaned back slightly, the subtle shift betraying her calculation that influence could still manipulate outcomes. But here, every attempt was cataloged and accountable. Monroe moved seamlessly into audio recordings, the soundproofed clip replaying snippets of the confrontation. Hayes's voice rang calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm only issuing a citation. Please step back." Claudia's voice, sharp and elevated, cut through the quiet residential street. "Do you have any idea who my husband is? Do you want to end your career tonight?" The courtroom's tension heightened as Monroe described the spatial details. At 8:42 p.m., Officer Hayes was approximately 12 feet from Mrs. Dunbar's SUV. She accelerated slightly over 5 miles per hour, enough to make him step back quickly to avoid being struck. The street itself, at 22 feet wide and lined with parked cars, left no room for error. Had he not reacted, the outcome could have been catastrophic. A quiet murmur rose from the gallery. Parents in the audience glanced down at their hands, the danger in the account refracting into personal fear. Witness statements reinforced the near accident's immediacy. Mrs. Joan Caldwell, a neighbor residing at 2208 22nd Street, testified that she saw Claudia lean toward the SUV's dashboard while shouting, gestures sharp and intimidating. Her eyes widened as she recalled, "I've never felt fear like that, seeing an adult corner a police officer in my own street, taunting him while standing less than 15 feet from his path. It was deliberate, frightening." The gallery absorbed each word, the human stakes translating from abstract incident to visceral reality. Monroe's voice then carried the subtext of systemic pressure. Following the incident, multiple calls were made to the Hartford Police Department requesting what Mrs. Dunbar termed professional courtesy. Internal reports reveal these calls exerted pressure on subordinates to minimize the documentation of the event. Prior attempts to suppress or delay reports were noted, including emails and informal messages implying potential career ramifications for officers who complied fully with reporting protocol. Claudia's hands clenched, though she maintained outward composure. The audience could perceive the imperceptible tremor of acknowledgement, the micro-expression of someone realizing that influence, no matter how wielded, left a paper trail now fully exposed. Her usual tactics, innuendo, subtle intimidation, reliance on her husband's rank, were systematically dismantled by evidence. The courtroom's emotional rhythm shifted as Monroe presented the final piece. Witness corroboration of the ongoing psychological impact on Officer Hayes. Hayes had been subjected to weeks of stress, questioning his professional judgment and safety, as colleagues hesitated under the implied weight of influence. The audience's collective attention tightened. Murmurs underscored a growing comprehension of human cost. This was no longer an isolated threat, but a pattern of misuse of power, a deliberate attempt to intimidate and manipulate public servants. Judge Caprio's gaze remained steady, deliberate, weighing each fragment of evidence and human testimony. The gallery's collective breath seemed to pause at his measured expression. Claudia's posture stiffened as Monroe concluded, "The documents, recordings, and eyewitness statements illustrate both the immediate danger posed to Officer Hayes and the broader implications of systemic interference, pressure applied, reports suppressed, and intimidation normalized." For the first time in the morning, Claudia's smirk evaporated entirely, replaced by a fleeting, subtle awareness that the walls of entitlement could not shield her from scrutiny. Whispers among spectators grew more deliberate, tension rippling through the room as the scale of influence colliding with accountability became undeniable. The weight of moral and legal reckoning had been firmly established, leaving an unspoken question in the charged air. What would justice demand next? By 10:58 a.m., the audience and courtroom alike recognized the pattern. The deliberate, repeated misuse of power, meticulously documented, morally and legally unassailable. The human impact was clear, the stakes had escalated, and the collision between status and law was no longer abstract. It was real, immediate, and morally undeniable. Officer Samuel Hayes rose from the witness stand at 11:32 a.m., adjusting the crease in his uniform as if steadying himself for a weight he could neither avoid nor soften. At 31, with 6 years of patrol experience, Hayes had seen the spectrum of human behavior in Hartford streets, but nothing had prepared him for the storm that erupted on December 17, 2024. The courtroom held its collective breath as he cleared his throat, the sound cracking the tense silence like a subtle opening chord before a somber symphony. "I remember the night clearly," Hayes began, his voice calm but taut with undercurrents of stress. "I was issuing a routine citation on 22nd Street at approximately 8:40 p.m. Mrs. Dunbar approached. At first it seemed like a misunderstanding, but her tone escalated quickly. She cornered me near her SUV, less than 12 feet away, and shouted, 'Threats that I can't ignore.' She said things that made it very clear she believed her husband's rank shielded her from any consequence." Hayes's hands gripped the edges of the stand, knuckles whitening slightly. His eyes flicked briefly to Claudia, whose posture remained poised yet subtly rigid, the first visible sign of tension marring her carefully constructed composure. "I felt unsafe," he continued, a pause letting the words sink. "Professionally, it was challenging. I had to step back to avoid being hit by her SUV, which she moved forward, albeit slightly, but enough to create danger in the narrow street. Every time I returned to the precinct after that, I could feel the weight of scrutiny, subtle pressure from colleagues who feared her influence, who whispered about professional courtesy. It wasn't just about that night. It was about a chain of intimidation that followed me for weeks." The courtroom absorbed each word. Some spectators shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, silently acknowledging the courage required to speak against a figure so entrenched in privilege. Claudia's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her smirk flickered for the briefest of moments, a shadow, passing across her otherwise unflappable face. At precisely 11:44 a.m., 14-year-old Julia Bennett, who had been seated in the front row with her mother, was called to the stand. Her small frame seemed to occupy the space with an unexpected gravity. Julia's eyes, wide with lingering fear, scanned the courtroom, lingering just long enough on Claudia to establish context. "I was on my porch," she said softly, "and I saw her yelling at Officer Hayes. She was so close to him, and I didn't feel safe going back outside for a week. I didn't know if she would be angry at anyone who saw her." Her voice trembled slightly, and for a moment the room was suspended in a delicate stillness. The collective realization of the human cost, the fear, the vulnerability, the invasion of safe space, settled over everyone. Murmurs began to ripple through the gallery, some subtle, others sharp in disbelief. Heads nodded in empathy. A few spectators' lips pressed tightly together as if absorbing a personal responsibility they could not articulate. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the bench. His gaze was precise, unwavering, morally calibrated. "Officer Hayes, Miss Bennett," he said, voice deliberate, "you are describing breaches not only of law, but of ethical responsibility. Mrs. Dunbar, are you beginning to understand the gravity of your actions? The real consequences beyond privilege or status?" The question lingered, a moral fulcrum pivoting the courtroom's energy. Claudia's eyes shifted to the floor for an instant, almost imperceptible, before returning to the judge. There was a micro-expression of hesitation, a subtle bite of the lower lip, and a faint tightening around the eyes. Privilege, once an invisible shield, began to erode as the weight of human impact pressed against it. Her usual dominance, the aura of entitlement she carried like armor, was challenged by testimony no wealth or influence could dilute. The gallery reacted in tandem with this shift. Observers felt the emotional tension increase as Hayes described his professional strain, the mental toll, the lingering unease after repeated intimidation. Julia's presence and words added another layer, the voice of a vulnerable witness grounding the courtroom in the tangible consequences of unchecked power. Whispers of astonishment and quiet acknowledgement underscored the ethical reckoning taking place. Claudia's posture subtly shifted, shoulders lowering fractionally as if a burden she had long denied was now palpable. Her lawyer's murmured reassurances seemed hollow in the face of direct testimony, the human voices that could not be overridden by influence or status. Judge Caprio's calm insistence framed the moral context. Accountability is not optional. Privilege does not exempt one from responsibility. By 12:05 p.m., the first tangible cracks in Claudia Dunbar's demeanor were undeniable. Her controlled breathing, the faint tension along her jawline, and the quick, deliberate blinking of eyes betrayed internal conflict. The emotional dominance she had wielded outside the courthouse dissolved into something rawer, more exposed. Human impact, the fear she had induced, the disruption to lives, the ethical violations, had shifted the balance. The courtroom, now palpably aligned with the voices of the harmed, absorbed the quiet power of this revelation. Witnesses had spoken, the defendant's facade had faltered, and the collision between entitlement and accountability was no longer abstract. The narrative arc, built on status and influence, was beginning to fracture under the weight of consequence. As the chapter closed, the audience sensed the shift. What began as arrogance meeting procedure had evolved into the unmistakable emergence of human truth, a force capable of challenging even the most entrenched privilege. The stage was set for the deeper exposure to come, where every pattern of misuse and manipulation would be meticulously unveiled, and justice's full measure would be realized. The courtroom was still thick with the echoes of Officer Hayes's and Julia Bennett's testimony when the next wave of revelation swept through the chamber. At 1:14 p.m., the atmosphere shifted from tension to something sharper, more precise, as investigator Rachel Monroe began detailing the systemic attempts to shield Claudia Dunbar from accountability. Her voice carried a measured weight, each word deliberately slow, as if allowing the gravity of each fact to settle on the ears of everyone present. Between December 18th and 22nd, multiple calls were made to the Hartford Police Department headquarters, Monroe said, producing records and call logs that had been painstakingly verified. Lieutenant Dunbar's colleagues received instructions, some explicit, some implied, to minimize reports of the incident on 22nd Street. Certain officers were subtly advised to let it slide or exercise professional courtesy. These communications were documented in both emails and internal logs. Additionally, we have evidence of 2 calls from high-ranking officials within city government requesting that no formal statements be filed and that any public record of the encounter remain vague. The murmurs that began softly in the gallery swelled into audible tension. Spectators glanced at each other. Some stiffened in disbelief. Others pressed their lips together as if restraining an involuntary sigh of moral outrage. Claudia's fingers twitched around the armrest of her chair, a small but undeniable sign that the walls of protection she had relied on were no longer abstract. They were being dismantled in real time. Her smirk, once automatic, flickered and waned as Monroe continued. These efforts were not isolated, Monroe added, showing emails with precise timestamps. December 18th, 8:47 a.m., December 19th, 11:02 a.m., December 20th, 5:16 p.m. The content ranged from vague suggestions to direct guidance, urging caution and leniency. Officers were reminded of Mrs. Dunbar's status and her husband's rank. The pattern indicates a coordinated attempt to preserve her influence while preventing full accountability. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression unreadable yet charged with moral clarity. Mrs. Dunbar, he said, voice deliberate, each syllable carrying the weight of ethical inevitability. It appears that not only did you engage in behavior that threatened an officer, but multiple layers of influence were mobilized to obscure the truth. How do you respond to this? Can you understand the severity of attempting to use connections to bypass responsibility? Claudia's eyes darted briefly to her lawyer, whose jaw tightened ever so slightly. There was a micro moment, barely perceptible, where her confident posture faltered, a subtle slump of shoulders, a flicker in her gaze. She opened her mouth, then closed it, swallowing a carefully rehearsed response. Silence hung between the words, a palpable moral vacuum, as if the courtroom itself was waiting for her to acknowledge the depth of systemic misuse she had now become undeniably entangled in. A hand rose in the gallery. A veteran patrol officer, who had been pressured subtly to dismiss the December 17th report. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but steady, "I was told by my supervisor not to make a formal report. I was advised it was preferable for everyone if this didn't escalate. I, I complied at first, thinking it was a minor misunderstanding. Looking back, I see it was part of a larger pattern of influence, protecting someone from the consequences of their actions." The officer's gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering for a heartbeat on Claudia, whose composure now felt increasingly brittle. The audience reacted as if collectively inhaling and exhaling in response to the uncovering of deliberate manipulation. Whispers, some incredulous, some reflective, rippled like subtle waves through the room. The realization was inescapable. This was not a one-time lapse or a mere accident of pride. It was a structured, intentional misuse of authority designed to shield power from accountability. Claudia's breathing became slightly more shallow. Her hands, which had rested lightly on her designer purse moments before, now clenched involuntarily. The flicker of shame was faint but unmistakable. A micro-expression around the eyes and mouth, a softening of the jaw that betrayed internal conflict. For the first time, the armor of entitlement was penetrated, not by words of law, but by the weight of evidence exposing her reliance on systemic complicity. Monroe placed a final exhibit on the stand. A timeline of calls and internal emails, every interaction meticulously cross-referenced. "This is the culmination of our investigation," she said, voice steady, controlled, moral pressure implicit in each syllable. "It demonstrates not just individual wrongdoing, but a network of influence activated to suppress the consequences of that wrongdoing. The pattern is clear, and the impact on those targeted, Officer Hayes, community members, is undeniable." The courtroom energy shifted palpably. Spectators' expressions were a mix of shock, comprehension, and moral indignation. Claudia's gaze dropped, briefly avoiding eye contact, then flicked upward, eyes reflecting the first true traces of vulnerability. The confidence that had carried her through flashing cameras, whispering admirers, and her own sense of impunity was now visibly fractured. She was confronted not only with her actions, but with the ethical breach executed through others, a reality no amount of privilege could rewrite. Judge Caprio's voice cut through the tension, calm yet resolute. "Power is a test, Mrs. Dunbar, and today you are seeing what happens when influence is used not to protect, but to evade accountability." The words hung in the charged silence, a moral fulcrum upon which the chapter's revelation pivoted, leaving the courtroom and Claudia herself, acknowledging that the architecture of protection had crumbled. The stage was set for the confrontation that would follow, a reckoning not of law alone, but of conscience as human impact and systemic exposure converged, forcing entitlement to confront its fragility. The courtroom was hushed, a heavy silence stretching over the spectators as the next phase of confrontation unfolded. At 10:07 a.m., February 13th, 2025, the air carried a tension far denser than any procedural formality. Officer Samuel Hayes, still in his pressed uniform, took a deep breath, his hands lightly clasped on the witness stand. Across from him, Claudia Dunbar sat rigidly, her designer heels tapping imperceptibly against the polished marble floor, a nervous tremor betraying the fragile veneer of composure she had worn since her arrival. The room seemed to contract around the weight of anticipation, every eye focused, every heartbeat a drum in the collective consciousness of the courtroom. "Mrs. Dunbar," Judge Caprio began, voice calm but edged with unwavering authority, "we have heard the evidence, the witness accounts, the patterns of influence. Now it is time for you to confront those most directly impacted by your actions. Officer Hayes, would you like to speak?" Hayes straightened, voice steady but low, carrying the restrained weight of months of stress and fear. "Yes, Your Honor." He inhaled sharply, eyes flicking briefly to Claudia, then back to the bench. "On December 17th, I was performing a routine traffic stop on 22nd Street when I was met with verbal threats, aggressive gestures, and intimidation. I feared for my safety, I feared for the people around me, and I feared that nothing would protect me because of your influence, your name, your status." He paused, swallowing. I have been carrying that tension with me every day since. The you? Courtroom responded with a quiet murmur. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others exhaled slowly, empathizing with the professional duty that had been so flagrantly disregarded. Claudia's eyes narrowed briefly, a flash of discomfort crossing her carefully maintained mask. Her hands twitched. The pristine leather of her purse creased under her grip. From the gallery, a small, trembling figure rose. Julia Bennett, 14 years old, had watched the December incident unfold from her front porch. She wore a pale blue cardigan and clutched the railing, her knuckles white. Her voice, though faint at first, carried unwavering moral clarity. Mrs. Dunbar, she said, taking a hesitant step forward, I was scared that night. I couldn't go back home without looking over my shoulder. You used fear like it was a shield, but it isn't fair. Power doesn't make fear fair. The courtroom seemed to inhale collectively. A soft gasp ran through the audience, the words settling like stones in water, rippling outward. Claudia's composure faltered visibly. Her lips parted, then pressed together, her eyes welling as the gravity of her actions crystallized in the moral clarity of a child's observation. She shifted in her seat, head bowed for a fleeting moment, and then raised it, blinking against the weight of unflinching accountability. I see it now. Claudia's voice was raw, breaking at the edges. I see the fear I caused. I see the wrong in using influence, using status to intimidate or avoid responsibility. I am sorry, not just legally, but morally. I never intended to hurt anyone, yet I understand my intentions do not erase the impact. Her hands shook slightly as she opened her purse and withdrew a folded envelope, hesitating before extending it toward Officer Hayes. I want to provide for your counseling and therapy sessions to help restore some of what was disrupted. I want to volunteer with community safety programs, to be part of preventing harm rather than causing it. Hayes's eyes flickered over the envelope, the weight of acknowledgement and potential restitution hitting him with complex emotion. Relief, residual anger, cautious optimism. Acknowledgement is the first step, he said carefully. Remediation is another. Words without action are meaningless, Mrs. Dunbar. I hope you are prepared to follow through. Claudia nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried the weight of sincerity. Her breath came in shallow, measured gasps as the first real fracture of pride transformed into recognition of responsibility. Judge Caprio's gaze swept the courtroom, capturing the subtle yet profound shift in energy. Justice, he said softly but firmly, is not only measured in punishment, but in the willingness to confront wrongdoing, to repair what can be repaired, and to acknowledge the human consequences of one's actions. Today, you have begun that path, Mrs. Dunbar. Let it be the beginning of accountability rather than the end of privilege. The gallery was silent for a heartbeat, then whispered murmurs arose, some nodding in quiet respect, some holding back tears, others simply staring, stunned by the depth of confrontation and the emergence of a moral reckoning that was rare in its raw honesty. Claudia's shoulders, once rigid, slumped slightly, the tension of entitlement giving way to a fragile, trembling openness. For the first time, privilege and power were fully confronted by principle and ethics. The human cost, laid bare by Officer Hayes and Julia Bennett, forced an emotional crescendo across the room. Spectators felt it in their bones. The collision of arrogance and accountability, the palpable shift as fear and entitlement yielded to remorse and recognition. The court had moved from evidence and procedure into a space where justice was not abstract, but intensely personal, intensely human. As the session adjourned for a brief recess, the weight of the moral confrontation lingered in the air. Claudia's journey had begun, not merely toward legal consequences, but toward understanding, restitution, and the painstaking work of regaining ethical equilibrium. The courtroom had witnessed the moment when entitlement fractured and accountability demanded presence, empathy, and reflection. The courtroom settled into a weighty, almost sacred silence as Judge Caprio adjusted the microphone, the gavel's presence heavy but restrained on the desk. It was 2:17 p.m., February 14th, 2025. The morning light streamed through the courthouse windows on 450 Main Street, Hartford, casting long shadows over the rows of spectators who had been present since the earliest hearings. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of relief, lingering tension, and moral expectation. Claudia Dunbar sat at the defense table, hands folded tightly in front of her, fingers brushing the crisp envelope that had once carried her offer of restitution. She looked smaller than she had a week ago, less polished, less untouchable, but still framed by a stubborn pride, now tempered by the undeniable weight of accountability. Judge Caprio began, voice calm yet resonant, drawing the courtroom into the gravity of the moment. After careful consideration of the evidence, the testimony, and the moral impact of your actions, I find that the law and the principles that uphold it demand a sentence that is both corrective and restorative. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Officer Hayes and Julia Bennett, acknowledging the courage of those who had spoken truth to power. Claudia Dunbar, you threatened not just a person, but the trust that binds community and law. Your conduct cannot be excused by influence, by status, or by the weight of privilege. Claudia's lips parted slightly, a shallow inhale, and her eyes met the judge's with a flicker of understanding. She nodded minutely, the first overt acknowledgement of responsibility visible to the gallery. You are fined $12,500, reflecting both the severity of your actions and the necessity of tangible accountability. You are suspended from any high society events or gatherings involving law enforcement personnel for a period of 1 year to prevent the recurrence of undue influence or intimidation. You will complete 120 hours of community service, specifically within youth safety programs across Hartford, to witness and contribute to the principles you undermined. Judge Caprio paused, allowing the weight of each condition to resonate across the room. Claudia's hands clenched briefly, then relaxed, the reality of tangible consequences settling over her like a cold, inescapable mantle. The audience absorbed each stipulation with a mixture of measured satisfaction and contemplative solemnity. The room was not celebrating vindictiveness. It was witnessing justice that spoke to moral, social, and human dimensions simultaneously. And finally, the judge continued, voice firm yet reflective, you are required to enroll in an ethics course designed specifically for individuals accustomed to privilege. The course will confront the intersections of power, responsibility, and moral accountability, ensuring that lessons extend beyond this courtroom and into the decisions you make moving forward. The words struck a chord beyond the punitive, underscoring the transformative aim of justice, rather than mere retribution. Claudia's eyes glistened with a restrained emotion, a mixture of humility, fear, and dawning comprehension. Her posture, once erect with a sense of untouchable entitlement, had softened. She exhaled slowly, her gaze flicking toward Officer Hayes, who nodded slightly, a measured acknowledgement of the balance achieved between restitution and accountability. Judge Caprio's expression softened subtly as he addressed the courtroom at large. This sentence is designed not only to impose consequences, but to restore a sense of trust, to remind us all that the social fabric requires courage, ethics, and the recognition that no individual stands above the law. Justice is not a tool of punishment alone. It is a mirror of our collective values, and it must reflect both fairness and opportunity for transformation. The courtroom absorbed the weight of these words. Some spectators leaned back, exhaling slowly, processing the alignment of law and morality they had just witnessed. Julia Bennett, sitting beside her mother, pressed her hands together, a faint smile breaking through her initial tension. Officer Hayes allowed a small, almost imperceptible nod, his own expression softened by the acknowledgement that fairness had been served in a tangible, meaningful way. Claudia reached for the envelope again, this time containing the commitment forms for community service and enrollment. Her fingers brushed the edges, and she looked up at Judge Caprio. I understand your honor, she said quietly, voice trembling slightly but sincere. I will comply. I want to do what is right. The judge inclined his head, the firmness of authority mingled with recognition of emerging accountability. Then let today mark the beginning, Mrs. Dunbar, not only of consequence but of responsibility. The true measure of justice will be in your actions in the weeks, months, and years to come. As the gavel struck lightly, signaling the formal conclusion of sentencing, the atmosphere shifted. The room exhaled as one, the tension dissipating into a profound sense of fairness achieved. Justice had been rendered not as an abstract decree, but as a tangible, morally resonant moment. Leaving Claudia humbled, the victims acknowledged, and the community reminded that accountability and principle endure above influence and privilege. The first drizzle of April 3rd, 2025, coated the streets of Hartford in a slick, reflective sheen as Claudia Dunbar tightened the straps of her rain jacket over her uniform for the first of many scheduled community service mornings. At 6:42 a.m., the air was sharp with the promise of cold, and the faint hum of early traffic under the streetlights provided an almost meditative rhythm. Claudia's breath fogged in the small clouds as she carried safety cones, laminated emergency procedure sheets, and the clipboard that would now dictate the next 6 months of her life. It was not the marble floors of her townhouse nor the hushed whispers of elite social circles that defined this morning. It was responsibility in its rawest, most unglamorous form. She arrived at Franklin Junior High at 7:03 a.m., greeted by the principal, a woman of brisk efficiency and no tolerance for pretense. The students assembled in the playground, sleepy but attentive, waiting for the drills that Claudia would now oversee. She took a moment, watching them stretch and yawn, feeling the weight of her new reality. Each child was unaware of who she had been, but entirely aware of who she needed to be now. Fatigue and humility set in immediately as she instructed the students on emergency exits, earthquake protocol, and stranger danger scenarios. Her voice, initially tentative and measured, grew confident in the cadence of genuine concern rather than performative authority. Later, in the narrow cobblestone streets of Hartford's West End, she assisted elderly residents with neighborhood safety workshops. From 10:12 a.m. to 11:47 a.m., she guided them through fire extinguisher techniques, proper reporting of suspicious activity, and situational awareness drills. Each instruction carried a dual weight: practical safety and moral reckoning. One elderly resident, Mrs. Galvin, leaned on her walker, eyes narrowed but curious. "You seem earnest," she said quietly. "That's something you don't see every day." Claudia nodded, a faint, tentative smile crossing her lips. She did not speak of fear or guilt. She let the work, the sweat and the cold, speak for her accountability. By May, the transformation became visible not just to herself, but to the community she served. A mid-morning drill at Jefferson Middle School found her running through scenario exercises under a drizzle that had soaked through her raincoat, hair plastered to her face, boots muddy. A student whispered to a friend, "She actually cares." Another child, trying to navigate the simulated emergency, looked to Claudia for reassurance, and she responded with calm patience, kneeling to their level, offering steadying words and a guiding hand. These were not gestures of status or obligation. They were the language of empathy, learned and refined through months of direct, repetitive engagement. Claudia's afternoons often brought her to Hartford's senior housing complexes. On June 8th, at precisely 2:30 p.m., she assisted in organizing a neighborhood watch simulation. The heat of early summer pressed against the brick facades, but she stayed the course, cataloging hazards, checking smoke alarms, and demonstrating safe exits. Each interaction was a lesson in humility. Mrs. Patel, an octogenarian with sharp eyes, questioned a drill method. "Why do we do it this way?" she asked. Claudia answered, careful and deliberate, "Because every choice we make affects someone else's safety, and everyone deserves to go home safe." In that brief exchange, the sentence she had received became tangible. Not a punishment, but a conduit to understanding consequences beyond her own self-interest. By July, local officers who had observed her service quietly acknowledged the change. Officer Hayes, at a community fair on the 14th, watched Claudia organize a safety scavenger hunt for students, ensuring children understood traffic rules and stranger awareness. He noticed her attentiveness, the deliberate patience in her gestures, the way she addressed every mistake with teaching rather than judgment. Her guilt and fear had been tempered into principle and disciplined action. She no longer carried the smirk of entitlement, but the focused demeanor of someone committed to making amends in ways that mattered. The public's response evolved gradually. Early skepticism, whispers about whether her participation was superficial, a performance for optics, faded as consistency revealed authenticity. Residents who had once crossed streets to avoid confrontation now nodded in acknowledgement. Parents allowed their children to approach her for guidance during drills. Students, some initially indifferent or sullen, began to treat her as a steady authority figure who embodied fairness, not privilege. Observers remarked quietly, this was not redemption claimed in a single act, but earned through repeated, often exhausting service, through persistence in the face of discomfort. Claudia's internal reflection deepened as the months wore on. At the close of a particularly cold morning in October, with fingers stiff from handling, safety equipment and shoes caked in mud from a storm the night before, she paused atop a hill overlooking the elementary playground. She felt the cumulative weight of each small act. Reassurance whispered to a trembling child, a safety tip repeated to a skeptical senior, the careful logging of minor hazards that could prevent disaster. The moral arc that had begun in a courtroom months prior had taken tangible shape. Empathy, responsibility, and recognition of her prior misuse of power had crystallized into disciplined, principled action. As November approached, Claudia's transformation was visible to anyone who had followed her journey. No longer a figure defined by status or social leverage, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that true authority is earned through service, that respect is cultivated through consistency, and that the consequences of one's actions ripple far beyond the self. Her days of early mornings, relentless schedules, and public accountability had reshaped not just how she was seen, but how she saw herself, an evolution from fear and guilt to a form of principled, actionable morality that spoke louder than words ever could. By December 12, 2025, nearly a year after the events on 22nd Street, the small streets of Hartford were quiet under the soft gray sky, a reflective calm that mirrored the community's subtle transformation. Julia Bennett, once a 14-year-old trembling on her porch, now strode confidently down the same block where she had witnessed intimidation months earlier. The corners of her eyes crinkled in cautious optimism, and she carried a backpack full of books, drawing notebooks, and a newfound sense of agency. The incident with Claudia Dunbar had left scars, but the months of restitution, the visible accountability, and the public acknowledgement of wrongdoing had carved a path for her to reclaim her neighborhood. She stopped briefly at the tree-lined intersection near her home, looking down the street she had once feared, and realized that fear no longer dictated her steps. In parallel, ordinary citizens began speaking in quiet, measured tones about what they observed, the subtle shifts in officer behavior, the increased transparency in police community programs, and the consistency of accountability that Claudia herself embodied. Conversations in coffee shops and libraries reflected a growing awareness that justice extended beyond the courtroom. One resident remarked to another, "It's strange. I actually trust that complaints get heard now. That power doesn't just skate by." There was a new rhythm to Hartford, a cautious confidence that systems could work if ethical principles were maintained, if accountability was visible and tangible. Law students from Hartford University began documenting the Dunbar case in ethics coursework, analyzing every layer, the initial threats, the misuse of influence, and the meticulously structured restitution. They pored over court, transcripts, witness statements, and follow-up reports from community service programs, using the story as a living case study. Discussions in seminar rooms revolved not only around legal culpability, but moral responsibility, asking in hushed, earnest tones how societal structures could fail or protect, and how individual choices ripple outward. The classroom became a forum where abstract principle met real-life consequence, and Claudia's ongoing service was cited as an example of transformation through disciplined effort. Journalists who had initially covered the December 17, 2024 incident revisited the story throughout the year. On October 28th, a prominent local reporter wrote, "Claudia Dunbar is no longer the woman whose SUV intimidated a patrol officer. She is the participant in community safety programs who checks smoke alarms, guides children through drills, and quietly demonstrates accountability. Change, when sustained and visible, can restore trust. These articles were read aloud in classrooms, discussed in civic organizations, and even referenced during community council meetings, signaling the story's influence beyond immediate participants. Judge Caprio, mindful of the philosophical stakes embedded in the case, attended a community drill at Lincoln Junior High on November 15th. Standing quietly to the side, he watched Claudia demonstrate proper emergency procedures, kneeling beside children to explain safe evacuation routes. He noted the subtle changes in her posture, shoulders no longer rigid with entitlement, eyes attentive and empathetic. Officers in attendance nodded in recognition of her consistency. Community members offered polite, guarded smiles, a sign of trust tentatively renewed. Caprio reflected on the deeper implication. Justice, when paired with deliberate restorative measures, could seed tangible community transformation. Julia Bennett, observing one of these drills, approached Claudia and asked a simple, earnest question. "Do you think anyone else can learn from what happened?" Claudia paused, eyes tracing the line of students in formation, and replied quietly, "I hope so. That's why I'm here. To show that actions have consequences and that everyone deserves to feel safe." Julia nodded, understanding more than words could convey, sensing that the ethical lessons of one incident could ripple outward to influence lives far beyond her own block. The neighborhood began subtle, quiet shifts. Children approached officers for guidance on safety procedures. Parents openly discussed concerns without fear of reprisal. Teachers integrated ethical discussions about accountability into lesson plans. Senior residents volunteered alongside officers in minor safety drills. The convergence of restitution, observation, and communal engagement created a lattice of trust and respect. Fragile but resilient, every small interaction reinforced a central truth. Accountability is not a single act, but a sustained, deliberate effort that changes the texture of daily life. In reflection, the Dunbar case served as a prism through which the community could examine power, consequence, and moral responsibility. The courtroom had delivered legal judgment, the months of service had demonstrated the potential for ethical correction, and the community's evolving trust symbolized the intangible yet enduring impact of principled justice. Judge Caprio's words resonated in the quiet of the local high school auditorium during his post-program visit. Justice is not simply punishment, it is accountability made visible, learning made practical, and trust restored through consistent action. The story lingered not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a meditation on the intertwining of accountability and redemption. Privilege had collided with principle, arrogance had confronted ethics, and through structured, visible transformation, the community experienced a renewal of trust in both law and human conscience. The narrative closed not with fanfare, but with the soft, enduring clarity that one case, meticulously adjudicated, humanly reconciled, and ethically sustained, could redefine expectations, restore confidence, and leave behind a legacy of moral reflection. The lessons endured. Power must bow to principle, consequences matter, and redemption is earned, measured, and witnessed. By the end of that December morning, Julia Bennett walked home with her head held high. Neighbors exchanged nods of respect across sidewalks, and Hartford, in small yet profound ways, felt the quiet strength of justice done fully, ethically, and humanely.